In his home country, Thomas Keneally is widely recognized as Australia's living national treasure and one of its foremost novelists. He's the author of over 30 novels, as well as plays and numerous works of non-fiction. His 1982 novel, Schindler's List, was awarded the Booker Prize and later adapted for screen by Steven Spielberg. This is Writers in Motion, jointly organized by Krakow Festival Office and Krakow UNESCO City of Literature. Thomas, I necessarily need to start this conversation by saying that both the circumstances of your visit to Krakow and the very setting here are quite extraordinary, because this is not only your first visit to Krakow after over more than 30 years, but also we're here in the office of Oskar Schindler, in the Schindler Factory, a museum dedicated to Oskar Schindler and the citizens of Krakow under Nazi occupation. How does it feel to be back to Krakow, and how does it feel to be sitting in this very office right now?
Well, it's wonderful to be here, and of course I remember when Spielberg was filming some shots in here. But when I first came here, it was in the company of a Schindler survivor, Schindler Juden, who was a great Polish patriot, and his name was Leopold Pfefferberg. He'd been an officer in the Polish army. He was a graduate of the Jagiellonian University, which he thought was the ultimate university in the world. And when we first came here, he had to talk his way into this building. I remember that there was a display of telephonic parts here. It was as if they were state secrets, and we had to argue our way to get in. Leopold did so with great gusto, and in a Poland where everyone was speaking in a whisper in 1981. And thus 1981 was a bit of an echo of some of the fears and anxieties that occupied Poles during the occupation.
And what was your impression of the city back then? Did it in any way affect the way you wrote about Krakow in your book?
Yes, I always thought of Krakow as an angelic city, but a stained angel of a city. And those who knew Krakow, when Spielberg was asking us where he should film the Schindler film, well, should it be Prague or here? You couldn't get out of Prague what you can get out of this city. And we all said, you've got to go to Krakow. So my first visit here with Poldek, my second visit was after the Soviet system had collapsed during the making of the film. And my third visit, Leopold Pfefferberg would be delighted to see that this has become part of the city museum, and that the name Schindler is helping to bring in foreign visitors and indeed helping the economy of Poland. He used to buy food parcels from a company in Chicago and send them to Polish families. And we had warm meetings with some of these families while I was here in 1981. And he would very much approve of this circumstance.
I've always been very much impressed by the detail with which you portray Krakow. I mean, even topographical details are just excellent. And also, the city of Krakow is one of the book's main characters. It's not just a kind of passive witness to the events, but it's very much attuned to the horrors that are taking place in Krakow.
Yes, I think the city, because I walked it with a man who'd survived that era, that was an important influence. But I think without being unduly flattering to anyone, how can you not be bowled over by Krakow and the splendor of its center, and then by a place like Płaszów, the horror on the edge of town, and indeed by the Jewish ghetto, which we also walked extensively, and Pankiewicz's pharmacy, which Leopold remembered well from his experience of the ghetto. And so altogether, Poldek was a good teacher of the city to me, and I've never forgotten it. I find myself describing the city to people occasionally, and we Australians live a long way from Europe. My excuse for writing about the Holocaust is that it always fascinated me as an unsatisfactory Catholic like Oscar, as I was, and as a man from the edges of the world. It always struck me that Europe was small and it was crammed with cultural glory, but it was also full of internecine hatred. And some of those hatreds are still around and are being voiced. But it reminded me of William Butler's, Yeats's description of my grandparents' island, which was much hatred, little room, damned us from the start. And Europe itself seemed to have little room and much hatred. So that fascinated me about Europe, that it was crammed with glories and also crammed with horrors.
Actually, there's a great scene in Schindler's List, I guess one of my favorite in the book, when one of the doctors in the ghetto hospital approaches one of the patients, touches his hand, and sort of through the skin, he can sense the whole history of the city, from the Austro-Hungarian glamour and cafes and romance, down to the very atrocity of the war. So, but Krakow is also, I mean, in terms of its involvement and in its presence in the whole imaginarium of the Holocaust, is also a kind of traumatic city. Did it ever occur to you to be a traumatic city?
Yes, indeed. I mean, the fact that the Wawel was debased by the presence of Hans Frank, and that the banner Judenrein was a banner that was a verbal banner that was raised by the Nazis with the Wawel at the center of it. That was typical, that the city had its dark history. And this is easy for someone to write about, and I do ask the Poles forgiveness for writing about their beautiful city and its hour of crisis in the 1940s. I have to say, I wasn't as far away from Nazism as you would think. First of all, I was raised in the Irish tradition of Catholicism, which said you are part of a universal church. And I tried to fit the universal church together with the church in Europe, and then what happened in the Holocaust, and all those contradictions, and again, all that glory and all that horror. And secondly, my father was an Australian soldier in the Middle East. When I was a child, I used to receive cake tins done up with surgical plaster. And I would open them, and in there would be mementos, Nazi mementos of the battlefield, and Italian fascist mementos of the battlefield in North Africa. And so even though I lived in Sydney, through the church and through my father's closeness to the Nazi regime, I felt part of the world. And it was on that basis that I presume to write about my fellow flawed Catholic, Schindler.
But you seem to be very much interested in the issue of war, right? Schindler's List is not the only one of your book that is concerned with this,
That is
with
true.
wars.
And I'm obsessed with prisoners too, because Judy, my wife, has convict forebears sent to Australia from Ireland by the British. And I have a great uncle who was sent for sedition from Ireland. So I am a bit obsessed with prisoners and with the phenomenon of, again, European conflicts and the way that people from the New World, Australians, stumble into them. And in World War I and World War II, the only way you could get a trip if you were an ordinary Australian was to join the army and fight in France.
Like,
So
like your characters in The Daughters of Mars.
Daughters of Mars. So they see the cathedral at Rouen, but they also see the horrors of the of gas warfare, of the most exotic or bizarre psychiatric conditions, and the most extraordinary wounds. And it seems that in Europe the two are connected. So I've written a lot about that, why we are like we are, and also about our crimes with the Aboriginals. That has been something on which I've written extensively. So the issue of race and fraternity across the boundaries of race have always been of great interest.
The afterlife of your book, and I'm mentioning not only the film by Spielberg, but also the very museum in which we are. This afterlife testifies not only to the appeal of the figure of Oskar Schindler, but I also think to a particular move from the deficit of memory to the memory boom or memory industry, which I think to you must be particularly appealing because to a great extent you are a historical novelist. You write historical fiction.
Yes, amongst other kinds, yes. I've just finished a novel. When I say amongst other kinds, I've just finished a novel about a 42,000-year-old skeleton of Homo sapiens, which was found in Australia. So writing about a man who lived in Australia, Homo sapiens, amongst the giant fauna of that time, giant kangaroos, marsupial lions, giant wombats, 2.5 tons large, writing about a man who lived 42,000 years ago is taking historical fiction a little far, but I'm just about finished it, and I've just about persuaded the English publisher to publish it. And so, yes, the European past fascinates me for the same reason that when I was a kid, Catholicism fascinated me, Catholic Europe. The impact of Catholicism upon art, which is so palpable in a city like this. But then in the seminary, I studied for a time to be a priest in the Irish tradition, and I found out it was a very bad way to meet girls. But on the other hand, I did have a professor who had studied the Dead Sea Scrolls, and he saw Judaism and Christianity not as polarities, as too often they were seen as being, but in succession to each other. And so I wasn't raised with the classic anti-Semitism. I had plenty of other prejudices, and I remember that a Schindler survivor, Leosha Korn, who was here in Schindler's camp and who was in his other camp in Moravia. She said when she came home from work in Australia as a displaced person sent to Australia, she said, Australia is a wonderful place. They hate all the other foreigners as much as they hate Jews. And so we have been sort of, I don't want to depict us as angelic. We've been equal opportunity haters. But it is true that we didn't have the classic European style anti-Semitism in Australia.
And in Australia, you're a living national treasure. And as a matter of fact, in Krakow, you're also, I mean, the city's treasure. You have your own bench in the planting gardens.
I have a bench, yes.
How do you feel about being Krakow's treasure?
Oh, look, if they're good enough, I'm an old man. I need all the love I can get. And if I knew the city had put in that bench, they spoke to me about it, and I am delighted. We've been looking for it once, but I know someone who knows where it is, and we're definitely going there.
Thomas Keneally, thank you very, very much for this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.